Our mission here at Feeding Green is to see that no one goes to bed hungry in Greene County. Yeah, we saw an immediate increase in need, particularly from parents with school-age kids who had been sent home from schools being closed. We were having parents telling us they were having to ration their food because their kids were home all day. They weren't getting paid, and they didn't have much food at the time. The resources weren't there yet, so we immediately saw an increase. We also saw an increase in the older population because they weren't comfortable coming out during the pandemic. So our home deliveries tripled, more than tripled, and it's still high. It has not gone back down. We deliver every Tuesday and Thursday. Fresh produce makes a huge difference. We are big fans of fresh produce. Our families love it. It's part of what they come in for, is the fresh produce. And when we get it in the summer months from local sources, that they love that even more. So we do get a lot from Blue Ridge Area Food Bank, but we love it in the summer months when our local farmers bring us stuff. So produce is very, very healthy for us. So that just fits right into what we're trying to create at the pantry right now. Absolutely. The produce is something really big that we're wanting to offer our families. There's no more hands-on than working in a garden and growing produce. So that is huge for us. Chestnut Grove has been supporters for the entire 26 years as well. So we can't thank you all for your commitment, and even throughout the pandemic. I know we received a lot of donations from individuals in the church, and it made a difference, believe me.
Invite our pastured produce folks to come up and take the stage, if you would, please. You just heard from the director of the Feeding Green Food Pantry. And Feeding Green was one of 3 partners that we engaged with when we considered launching this project. And the hope was that we could grow it and other people would give it away. And these folks already had pipelines in place, if you will, to distribute the 6,000 pounds of produce that we grew in the first year of this project. So I've asked some of our friends and the key folks who were a part of leading this initiative last year and this year, if they would come and share with us some of the questions. I want to introduce you just really quickly. On the left, you have Heather Bailey, longtime Sunday school teacher, deacon at Chestnut Grove, and happens to be the owner, as it turns out, of 1/2 of the property that we grew the pasture on this year. Mitzi Hammer was one of the key catalysts in bringing the people together. We had, I don't know, almost 200 volunteers over the course of, I don't know. I hope I'm not exaggerating. Okay, but Mitzi was the one responsible for enlisting in these folks that are a part of Chestnut Grove and beyond, and she is almost magical in that regard. Benny Clark, lifelong, grew up on a farm, knows about growing some things, but he also has always been interested in ministering to our community in tangible and innovative ways. And so he has been a diehard partner from the very beginning of this. On the right side, we have the Hatcher men, 2 of the 3. Grayson and Josh. Grayson may be the first harvester of both seasons. I don't know that, but he was one of the most frequent flyers at the garden last year and maybe again this year. And his dad, Josh, has agreed to be the team leader. This is our 2nd year of the Pasture Produce Ministry, and Josh agreed to take on the responsibility of being the leader and coordinator of this year's effort, in spite of the fact that he knows nothing about growing vegetables. As we started, he now knows quite a lot about it, and we're thankful, Josh, for your leadership here. So we have some questions to engage with together, and Barbara, I think you have the first one.
So we've actually asked each group that's spoken just to start with what is one word that would describe your experience in the pandemic?
Blessed.
Annoying.
Inconvenience.
Formative.
Enlightening.
Very good. I know each of you could spend more words than just one, but thank you for the discipline of that exercise. Next question is this: what did you learn about you in this pandemic time? Specifically, what did you observe about your emotional health and well-being and your spiritual vitality during a time of pandemic? What did you learn about you?
I think for me, emotionally, I feel like coming out of it, I feel emotionally recharged because pre-pandemic, you're going here, you're going there, you're working all day, and then you've got sporting things on the weekend, and you're never home. You spend a couple hours with your kids, a few nights a week, and even less time with your spouse probably. So like, I was fortunate enough not to lose my job. We did lose Liz's dad earlier this year, but not as part of the pandemic. So we didn't lose anyone we knew. So like, we just spent a lot of time together. I was working from home, so I got to wake up in the morning and spend time with my kids and my wife, and we would go on trips on the weekends, and you feel kind of guilty because like some people had a really crappy year, and like we had a pretty good year. So as it relates to the pandemic anyway. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel guilty for feeling so blessed in a year of pandemic.
What I learned about me during the pandemic was that if I don't see anyone for too long, then I'll feel lonely, and it'll make me like cranky, grumpy, and it'll get to my head. So yeah, that's what I learned about me during the pandemic.
I mentioned inconvenient. For me, it made me stop and realize how my priorities were so simple. Like, well, this is interfering with where I'm going to go out to dinner now. And then finally you get convicted of the fact that a lot of people are not having anything to eat anyway. So get over yourself a little bit. So I think from a spiritual standpoint, it causes me to reevaluate my priorities and how to go about changing some of the actions that I do. Put actions behind a lot of my vocabulary, I guess. So I think spiritually I read more. I also wrestle with more realities about things I know that need to be fixed in my culture. But before, I just knew what they were, but never struggled with trying to figure out how to be a part of the solution. And now I'm trying to figure that out. So it's caused me to pause and think. I've broadened my perspective of what my moral responsibility of my culture is, like poverty and race and social injustice, and those things really have come to the forefront for me in this period.
Spiritually, when the pandemic hit the United States, and first was the schools coming to closing their doors and sending the kids home, and then within a couple of days realizing that they were not going back, very quickly into that, being able to lean on a friend who may or may not be sitting right here, who called and said, this has been brought on my heart that we need to get this group of people together. And that alone began setting the foundation for how I was going to continue to grow and move through the pandemic year of 2020, but how important it was to know that I wasn't alone. And the folks that fell upon Heather's heart to bring together were not the people that I think anyone would have thought would have been brought together for this intimate moments that we were able to have, where we were able to come together. And we were just talking, we were sitting beside each other during the time that we needed and took to speak about to each other the questions that Lance asked earlier. And we were able to still worship God. And we would meet sometimes at 7:30 in the morning, which was tough for one of us in the group. Sometimes we would meet, only because I had other things I was doing. Sometimes it was 8:30, but we would never have an end time. And there was one beautiful morning where we had been worshiping for 4 hours and 10 minutes together and had literally not looked at a watch, a phone, anything. And so that set the stage for being gracious for the relationships that were there. I use the word formative. So really being appreciative and grateful to God for the people that he had put into my life and how we were going to strengthen each other to then go out and be a part of his kingdom, and just the realization of the strength that I have in Jesus Christ, and being unshaken in how I wasn't scared. So as Josh said, he felt a little guilty for feeling blessed, and 2020 was a good year for his family. There was some guilt that I emotionally was not really terribly upset. Obviously, I was very sympathetic or empathetic to the folks that were having a tough time, like what Josh said and what Benny said. But emotionally, I was so happy that I had that strength in Jesus Christ, and that only became stronger because of friendships and the people that we were able to surround ourselves with, the Hammer family in our community.
Well, that was really nice to hear. Is this on? Okay. So 2020 was a hard year for our family. It was really beautiful. We had lots of great moments. But we all worked a lot harder at our jobs. We were grateful to still have them, and that was a huge blessing. But we went through a lot of transition with our son moving out and going to school, not being able to celebrate him and that the way that traditionally people get to do. My husband worked probably twice as hard as he already did, and he was working pretty hard already. So that was hard, but and also we all got it, so that was hard. That's sometimes still a little hard, but in all of that, in the silence of and the quiet that came with things shutting down, the reason I said enlightening is because I really, having the noise removed from my life just made me realize what I value and what I want and what I need to be intentional about, and maybe wasn't being intentional about. What I thought was an authentic existence had some level of authenticity for sure, but that I wanted that to go deeper and that I wanted it to be more meaningful, and that I'm going to work really hard on that. Like, that's going to be very important to me going forward. So just a reevaluation of priorities and health. I'm not going to lie. If you didn't get it, it kind of sucks. So I've had to work on my health a lot this year. And even in that, it has been really beautiful to piece it together and get stronger and get healthier and value health, like tangibly value it. Like we all kind of value, like, hey, yeah, I'm healthy, I'm good. But to really have no choice but to sink in and say, I have to get better. And I'm still kind of working on that, but mostly I'm there. But it was so hard, and it became so important. And it's probably the one thing that I will just not compromise on going forward. It's that valuable to be that sick and get better. I'm grateful. I'm so grateful that I got to be one of the people to get better.
And we are thankful also. And I'm just going to use that word priority to jump into the next question. And so each of you has put the Pasture to Produce in some light as a priority in your lives. So why? Why you and Pasture to Produce? And then what do you feel has been the function of Pasture to Produce in our community? And then as how has it brought the kingdom closer? Both thinking through those questions.
So for us, when we as a church we pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I was pretty sure that God's will is for hungry people to be fed. And so, last year I had a little extra time, I had a little extra money, I had 2 boys who really love hard work, especially in the heat. So, it just made a lot of sense for us to go spend some time in this field with some friends and move rocks and, plant stuff and come back a little bit later and pick it, So that's why us. The function, I think, obviously it filled, the Pasture to Produce filled a gap that was widened by the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. A lot of people obviously lost their jobs, and we heard from Feeding Green that the need for food increased. So I think that we were able to at least address some of that gap to kind of maybe try to close it, at least back to pre-pandemic levels. I don't know. But that's me.
For me, as a community, the function of Pasture to Produce was to feed people who were hungry to start with, and then the pandemic came and people lost their jobs, and there were more hungry people. And so I'm just glad to know that we're helping people have food, and I'm glad for that fact.
It's really important that people have fresh food. Another thing that grew out of this is that Jeff Robbins led a crew and built a cold room for the Feeding Green new building, and which means all the produce that we produce goes into that cooling room so they can hold on to it. So it's about an 8-by-8 room, and so which all of that was a part of Feeding Green, and just producing the produce. If you produce 6,000 pounds of good stuff, what are you going to do with it? And so you needed the coolers to do that, and not just refrigeration, but these cool rooms were really sufficient. So that's part of Chestnut Grove also. And so feeding, the Pasture to Produce really addresses one of the admonitions that Peter and Paul had. Lance mentioned a moment ago, they had a little conflict right there at the early part of the church. I bet you're surprised there's any conflict in church when it first started. But anyway, there was a little conflict. But the one thing that they came out of that meeting to discuss was, remember, our number one priority, don't forget the poor. Now, that happened in 49 AD, and it still needs to be we still need to be reminded of that every day, because I read something just recently that 140 million people in this country, if they were hit with a $500 bill that was not in their regular funds, they may be bankrupt. Isn't that amazing? 140 million people. So we still got a long way to go to make some kind of parity here. So if we can do it a little bit with a garden out there, then we're going to do a little bit of it.
So my involvement with Pasture to Produce came from Lance seeking out folks in his circle that could bring different skill sets and different knowledge bases to the table. And so my husband Aaron and I were two of those lucky few people that could come to a smaller table as we were able to bring Lance's very clear God-given vision to life for our community. And so being amongst that core group and then eventually laying out the plan and working the plan, that is where my involvement came from. So very fortunate to be a part of this church who from the very get-go wants to know how you can grow spiritually, but what you can share with your community to help in that mission. And everyone can dig in the dirt, no matter how old you are. You might not be able to make it more than 5 or 10 minutes without taking a break, and that's cool. But then there's others that will work for 4 hours and get a 400-pound boulder out of the middle of the field. Lance and Josh. So that was why I was brought to Pasture to Produce. And in terms of what it did, in terms of my ability to help the community, financially, it was a little bit of a rocky year. And so we saw our community here in Chestnut Grove be able to financially pour out with such generosity. And so a big part of the involvement was sweat equity for Aaron and I. We could not write a check, but we could be out there and help your generosity become a reality through working together and making it that priority. And I was fortunate enough to be in the office for part of the year and could help with organizing with the different food banks that already had the infrastructure in place to distribute the food. And just that humility of the other person on the other side of the phone saying, yes, we'll absolutely take your produce. And to see it all come together so seamlessly, it's a beautiful story.
Well, my involvement really, I have worked out there, but I had some of the land, which I was really grateful for. Also, it was sitting there doing nothing, so it should, not be a freeloader and do something for the community. And so when Lance called and asked about if we would be interested, I couldn't say yes fast enough. I was super excited about that. But the biggest thing for me, and if any of you who know me on any level know that Acts 2:42 through 47 is like one of my most favorite scriptures in the entire Bible. And it's, talking about being the early church and not going to church, but being the church. And so every single time I walk back there and there's people back there, or I see something growing, or I'm digging in the dirt, which, by the way, if you don't like digging in the dirt, you should try it. It's so freeing. It's so freeing for the soul. It's so amazing. But I just always, that scripture just always comes to my mind, always. I love that scripture because the church with a capital C gets kind of a bad rap for just like being a spectator sport, or staying within their walls, and not really, like, even though we do give to communities, like, we just get a bad rap. And to be out there and seeing that happen, seeing the produce being grown, seeing the community come together because they saw a sign at the Earlysville Exchange and they're like, I had no idea. And then they just show up, and then next thing you know, you're kind of friends with them. And, it's a beautiful thing, and it's all under the umbrella of the church. And so it plants a seed. Ha ha. Come on, laugh.
Well done.
It plants a spiritual seed that I think can grow within people who might not have thought about coming to church. And I think this sort of segues into another question that's going to be asked, but I just think that it helps make us a little bit contagious. Like, I kind of want what those people have. If they're willing to come out here in 100 degrees and dig in the dirt so that people they don't know can have food, I kind of want some of that. Like, I want to be like that. I want to feel like that. I want to contribute like that. And I think that that's an underlying emotion that Pasture to Produce brings.
Brilliant. Heather, I couldn't have paid for a better segue to this last question. I love, especially how you talked about, for you, the difference between going to church, which the Bible doesn't talk a lot about that. But the first picture of the church is the church being the church. And when the church is the church, it's compelling. When you're sweating in 100-degree weather, picking up rocks, there's something that at least causes you to ask the question, what is this about? And when one of you gets to say, God has always, 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 always cared about the poor. Always. It's never changed. And now we're just participating in this ancient thing that God's always been doing, and that is feeding people and using us and our extra sons and our extra time and our extra money, pitching it together, and participating in this thing that God's doing. You don't have to explain it a lot. You're just able to say so simply, something really special is happening here. I don't know all of what's happening, but... Heather, I'd like you to, if you would, carry on with this last question. And the last question for me, for us, is presupposing that I'm right, that we're right, that God is leading the church with a capital C from one arrangement, a pre-pandemic arrangement, to a post-pandemic arrangement, presuming that's true. What did you learn, especially through Pasture to Produce, that we need to keep in mind as we craft what the future, what Christian congregationalism looks like moving forward?
Sure. I am of the same belief that that it is being rewritten, and I think that, just like I said a minute ago, being the church is going to be a whole lot different than going to church. I don't think that just going to church is going to, it's not about checking a box anymore. It's like we all want things in our life that have more value, because we had so much stripped away that after we rested, right, from having things stripped away, like the things that we want in our life need to have substance. And so I think doing things where we do get to be the church is going to be important. But I also think things like what Mitzi and I were talking about, or Mitzi was talking about earlier, that we were able to engage in, is authentic, deep, meaningful worship, and those experiences that are free and and honest. Like, I think that it's going to be really important that we come to church to be with God and not just learn about God, or we're learning from Him, that when we're worshiping, that worship is for Him and it's meaningful. And I think that those are life-changing experiences that deepen who we are and in Him, and the deeper we are in Him, the more meaningful it all continues to grow and be, and that in turn is contagious or weird. It just depends on who we are and the people that we associate with. But I think that contagion is what will grow the kingdom. You know, salvation alone adds to our numbers, but abiding in Christ and being with Him and knowing Him on a deeper, more meaningful level is what's going to want people to want it, outside of just the idea of going to church.
You should do a mic drop right there.
Okay, that would be weird, but
Thank you.
okay.
So I did not start coming to Chestnut Grove until, I guess it's now been maybe 6 years, maybe still on the later into 5 years. And one of the reasons was by a simple invitation. And as I said at the 9 o'clock service, Lance knows that that's pretty much my philosophy in life, is invitation, and asking more than once. If somebody doesn't say yes the first 3 times, maybe they need that 10th time, and then they might say yes. And so, you know, when I panicked, whatever year that was, I was like, oh my gosh, the preacher's wife is coming to help me for 8 hours to paint a piece of plywood. This is going to be awfully difficult to do. And at the end, she's like, well, come to church, and if you don't like it, you don't have to come back, but if you like it, you can come back the next week. And I was like, oh, that's how that works. And so that's how I see this being moving and transitioning, and like you said, taking with us what we learned. And last year with the Pasture to Produce, putting it out there into the community to come and be involved was not, it might have been a 50-50 split for congregation members that were coming to volunteer, and also just community connections through acquaintances at the Earlysville Exchange, people that I had in my past life that were lucky enough to be on my email list when they first started getting the Sign Up Geniuses. But they came. They were invited and they came. So that is where I feel we just keep going. And the creative side of things, just sitting here this morning as I had a break, I was like, man, I really wish that there were some tables, or not, like a coffee table and sofa somewhere in this church, to where when the youth had their Sunday 2 weeks ago, and Mariah, you talked about yay, this older person asked me to go to coffee with them. I'm totally not calling you. And so it's that invitation to, okay, if you don't want to have to scramble and clean your house, then let's have the church. Let's have the church inside. Let's have the church outside. Let's have the Pasture to Produce with lawn chairs on our shoulder. Be a place where we invite each other to come, both young and old, because the spectrum of people who are able to worship God needs to be that broad from birth to death. And I've learned so much from being able to witness Benny and Jack Raymond out there, and for the fact that Jack Raymond is entertainment, and the excitement of seeing the Farr family walk up with literally no shoes on any of those children running through the field. And it was beautiful, that participation.
I was going to say, I hear you say Pasture Produce gives us a place to do life on life and to do it multi-generationally. I love it there with both Benny and Grayson. And you two both benefit a lot from being together in ways that will bear out later, probably. But am I reflecting back some of what you're saying, Mitzi, about Mariah also had the same kind of? Thank you. What do we need to take forward, Benny?
Well, you know what's really been fun is that I've met people in the garden, and then I've seen them at church. And it's kind of a switch. See them at church and then maybe convince them to go to the garden. Actually, they were in the garden and they decided to come to the church. And that's really been kind of an eye-opener. But that's the way it always works. You know, if the church is out where it's supposed to be, it's not hard to get a crowd together if the church is being the church. And so the other thing I think that I've picked up on in this 14, 15 months is, like Grayson said, it can get pretty boring when you don't have anybody other than just the same group of people to talk to all the time, because they can't say anything new that you hadn't already heard. So one of the things that has really been important for me is to find ways of communicating with people who I don't normally communicate with, and so that's been good. Also, the worship outside was really significant to me because, not just because it was outside, but it really was a liturgical experience. In other words, the litany came from the congregant rather than the preacher and the rest of the staff. And that was really significant to me, because I remember one time Len said, we're going to sing this song, so anybody want to lead it? And Rebecca stands up and says, yeah, I'll lead it. Uh-huh. And that kind of refreshing experience of church is really significant to me. And so I think the pandemic kind of brought that out, that we need, I think that church is a participatory experience rather than just a consumer experience. And I think that's really, really important. And
thank you for helping making that true even right now.
Yeah, I hope we haven't lost it when we came back in. Yeah, okay.
I couldn't preach a sermon nearly as good as that one, but you just, so thank you for.
Amen.
Yeah.
I think for me going forward with the church, you know, we have all these ministries in the Earlysville Exchange and the Pasture to Produce, and we go out and to the community to be the church, that we don't forget to take care of the home as well. You know, we've been home with our families for a year, and we all came out and did these new projects out in the community to try to help some of the people that were most affected. And now our schedules are filling back up. Things are becoming more normal, and you really want to keep helping those people that out there that are hungry or, you know, need help in for whatever reason. So you want to add that to your normal routine, but don't let the family and the house kind of fall to the wayside. I think that's important for the church to help guide the families to remember that God has to be in the family and at home as well as out in the community.
Love that. Hey, Josh, one of the things that you and I have talked about a little bit, and Barbara and I and Zach are working on, is one of the things we've learned in pandemic is it's important for our children and our older folks to be together. And the church often is structured such that we send our kids off one way, we send our children to the nursery, we send our youth upstairs, and we miss the richness of Grayson and Benny sitting beside each other, and Mitzi. And there's something about, one of the things we're looking at right now is what does a new kind of liturgical gathering look like that is intentionally multi-generational and structured so that it's that way instead of us being all apart. So watch for that this coming summer. That will be part of our rhythm, it looks like, this summer. So, and recognizing that God is everywhere. God's at home. God's in the garden. God's here at church. God's in you. God's in me. Breath of God, feet of clay, every one of us. It's the design from the very beginning. I really appreciate how you folks have put those things together to participate together in something that God seems to be doing in the world to take care of the folks who need a little extra in this last season. Friends, for those of you who don't know, we still need more hands in the garden. Josh told me at the break, because I'd really like to have everybody come once instead of 6 people coming 20 times. And that would also free people up to pay attention to their homes and their families if all of us pitch in. Josh will show you how to pull weeds if you don't know. How to harvest a zucchini, you can have that experience. If you, our website has the Pasture to Produce sign-up link, and I encourage you to take off your shoes and go on out there and pick potato bugs with Grayson. He'll show you what they look like. And friends, I told you we had 3 partners from the very beginning, folks who already know how to get food to people who need it. And Jane Colony Mills is the director of Loaves and Fishes. It's one of the larger outfits in town that regularly gives food to our hungry neighbors. We're going to let her have the last word about our project this year.
Loaves and Fish's mission is to give food with kindness and compassion to anyone who seeks help, and also to provide an opportunity for people in our community to help serve their neighbors. We saw a 50% increase in new households in last April of 2020. So there was really a switch from people who are retired and rely on food pantries like ours to supplement the income that they have from their retirement, and people who live on disability benefits and SNAP benefits, which are what we used to call food stamps. That we saw a huge increase in new people coming. And then we started seeing a real different change in the types of people we were serving. We were seeing people driving Hummers, people driving Mercedes, people in, well-dressed who had suddenly been kind of met with a misfortune they never anticipated. The receipt of fresh produce makes a huge difference in the quality of food that food pantries are able to give out. If you have done any research or study on the history of food pantries, they started as you would give one brown paper bag, for example, full of shelf-stable foods, things like canned beans, which are full of protein and carbohydrates. What Loaves and Fishes has worked very hard to do is to improve food quality over time. And having the addition of fresh produce to what we give out just raises it to a whole new level. We have done surveys of the people who come to us, and they've told us that the number one thing they want is meat. But the number 2 thing is fresh produce, and after that, dairy. So we have really worked hard in the past year to go beyond where we were before, and using gifts like we got from Pasture to Produce have allowed us to really expand the amount of produce that we're giving out. And so we're giving out 15 to 25 pounds of produce alone to people coming in for food. We would love to receive additional fresh produce from Pasture to Produce this year. It has been a great gift to us to be able to share locally grown fruits and veg. And, because a lot of the food that we get is either sourced through the USDA anywhere in the country, or it's from local grocery stores. It's food that we're rescuing that they can't sell. And that can come from South America, it can be from anywhere. So, and Charlottesville is such a foodie town that even people who can't afford to buy their own local food should be able to eat it. And if we can get it through sources like Pasture to Produce and local farmers, that's the stuff we really want to give out. Nobody should be receiving less than just because they earn less than. They deserve the best food, as we all do. You know, one of the things that we've really struggled with is access. How do we help people access the food we have available? We've solved the problem of available food. We have food, lots of food. Where the challenge lies is that we live in this huge big county with no public transportation in the county, really, or very, very minimal. And a lot of people who are low wealth don't have enough money to afford a vehicle. So, you know, what we've tried to expand more during the pandemic is something called the proxy or the alternate system, where someone can be designated to pick up food for someone else. So perhaps if you have a friend or someone in your community who you know needs help with food, you can volunteer to pick up food for them. All we need at Loaves and Fishes is their permission for you to receive their food. And that's, you know, that's a trust issue. A lot of people maybe don't know their neighbors or don't know. I mean, we've become kind of isolated, even more isolated than we were before during the pandemic, in that, you know, nobody was talking to anybody. But there are a lot of neighborhoods where neighbors don't know neighbors. And so if you actually do know someone and they trust you to come and collect food for them, then we can make that happen.